Well, hi everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar, special webinar. I think we've got a few more people that might be joining us, but I think we should get going, and because you've very kindly, quite a few of you have joined us on time, which is good. Look, I'm very pleased and privileged to be able to introduce you to Jules Pretty. I'm sure quite a few of you will know Jules from various activities. I thought about how I should introduce him. I looked on the back of his recent book, Sea Sagas, which is our kind of main focus of tonight's chat, where he's described as an environmental writer, educator, and storyteller, which I kind of liked that little triplet. But you know, a number of you might know Jules from his work at the University of Essex. That's certainly where I kind of met him, but you might well have met him in the bookshops of Suffolk or wider worlds of East Anglia or beyond. I mean, he's written a number of books before, many favorites perhaps that you might have, and certainly don't feel that you can only ask questions about Sea Sagas, because Sea Sagas only came out last month, and this in a way is a kind of official university type launch. But obviously I'm just looking like regenerating agriculture, for example, is very much in at the moment. That might be something, you know, that you're particularly interested in. The edge of extinction, we're hoping to kind of cover a little bit of discussion of aspects of climate emergency, biodiversity loss, etc. So up to you to a certain extent. Jules, how would you want to introduce yourself on this fine evening?
Well, I think that would, yeah, fine, warm, isn't it? Crikey.
Yeah, ridiculous.
It's 30 degrees in France at the moment. That's very nice. That's lovely. I think we can go with that. And we should say, just by way of logistics, that the chat box is the way to ask questions and answers. So if participants would like to raise anything, I think that's the way you do it on a webinar. It's not going to be by raising hands or putting on your camera. So pop them in the chat box, and then we will deal with them as we go through. We've got a plan of what we want to cover, but then we'll pick up things as we go along. That's right, isn't it, James?
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely, Jules. Thank you for stating that. I've just put in something just saying hi to everyone in the chat. And to be fair, I think having done a few of these, I think this is the better way. It's the kind of smoother way. You can certainly, you know, do put your questions in, and please don't. If we don't answer it straight away, what we're looking to do is maybe have a bit of conversation, and then come to some of the questions as kind of works within the conversation as much as anything. But if you have just a kind of more random question, if you like, do chuck that in, and I'll certainly try to kind of keep an eye on those and come back to them. I mean, the format, essentially, we've said that we'll kind of draw things together by about 7:45 or so. We certainly want to have some time in at least sort of 2 blocks where we take questions from yourself. Jules has kindly agreed he'll do a couple of readings from the new book, which is great. I always think that goes down particularly well. To that extent, Jules, maybe we could begin. Maybe, I mean,
absolutely, let's do that. Yep.
Should we just start, if it's okay with you? I was just thinking about the book. It is called Sea Sagas. Do you want to do a brief summary of maybe what the book's about? What are Sea Sagas?
Yeah, certainly. I think that kind of the framing context for this is, as you mentioned, the 3 big kind of global crises, I think, as we would see them, as you've written about it, and I have as well, and many others: the climate crisis, the ecological one, and the social inequality that goes side by side and deep inside those. And they all have kind of the same proximate causes, as well we know. Tying to that is this kind of understanding of the web of life, the interconnectedness of things, of people, of cultures and places, and how we then make sense of them, and that is through storytelling. And so I want to talk a little bit about storytelling, about how we came to the sagas in the book, but I also want to talk a bit about hope as well, that those big crises can weigh heavily on our shoulders, and it can feel a bit bleak at times, and I think it's important to know that there is hope, and there are opportunities to get through the dark forest, as it were, if we can use that kind of metaphor here. So it is the age of the Anthropocene. We know that. We brought this on, those kinds of things we've talked about. So we need to find the path out of the difficulties. And by definition, we ought to be able to do that. So I want to say something about that. In 1939, Bertolt Brecht, the playwright and poet, said, in the dark times, will there also be singing? And he answered that by saying, yes, there will also be singing about the dark times. And the point is that when you're in dark times, you've got to find better ways of telling stories, not just songs, but any way of expressing what it means, how to come together, how to create kind of collective action to deal with these sorts of things, and how to kind of make sense of a world in change. So in a sense, that's the background to Sea Sagas of the North. The background to this was the focus. The North focuses on the North Sea and the East and North Atlantic, and the narrative arc of the book is traveling sunwise from Iceland to Norway, Denmark, east of England, north of England, Scottish Islands, and the north and in the west, the Faroes, and back to Iceland again. And what became kind of clear was that the people on the edges of the land looked inward towards this sea. There is an inland sea in Japan, and I kind of coined that term for this as well. It was and is like an inland sea where people look inwards towards the sea and across the sea to other people whom they feel close to. And this kind of all started when I was talking to an old fisherman, a famous skipper on the Suffolk coast a few years ago, towards the kind of beginning of this project. And he'd won the famous Prunier Trophy for the biggest catches as a drifter, a skipper, biggest herring catches, and it was well known and well liked and understood. And he said, the big thing is that we used to be more tolerant and kind in our communities in the days of the fishing, because the fishing took us to other places around the North Sea and the North Atlantic. And we interacted with people. We gave gifts, we received gifts, we came back with stories about those places, and we took stories back to them. So even though people were competing for the fish, the same fish as it were, on another level, they weren't at all. They were in the same game. It was like a sports game. You're competing with another team, but you're playing the same game. And they would say, and I found this repeatedly, and other people have written about this, that inland people felt that places 10 miles inland were more remote than places 100 miles, 200, 500 miles away across the sea. And that was the kind of change that I think that was that kind of prompted me to realize that actually these times need kindness, togetherness, hope, which was there. And in the ecological collapse of fishing, which is a kind of, it's a fish system that disappears because of human intervention, but because of that, you get social change and collapse and economic and cultural change on the coasts of everywhere that used to rely on fishing. So the two are tied closely together.
That's really nicely put. And it's very interesting, that idea that, one of the ways in which I think we have found hope in recent times with certain ecological and biodiversity matters has been this whole kind of issue around rewilding, and even like sea wilding, that is a term that's being used, occasionally. But that idea of rewilding the sea, which again relates to these fishing matters, and what goes along with rewilding is this sense of hope. Is this, it's a kind of collective community. Often, at best, it's collective and community led, and we're seeing various projects around Britain, etc., that are doing exactly this. And as you say, taking that burden of kind of eco anxiety away from the individual, which is what we're kind of all being kind of dumped with. It's like we're kind of like, sorry, I didn't actually cause this, but you individually should have some guilt on this, rather than say moving it to larger corporations that can actually do something about this. It seems like the pressures on us as individuals to kind of recycle more or something, which is I hate to say it, but that's not going to solve it. You know, so it's very interesting. I thought as I was reading your Sea Sagas and listening as much as anything to again that notion of interconnectedness, the ways in which, you know, we need to work together as communities to solve our problems. I thought that was very nicely put.
Exactly. Paul Hawken, in his wonderful recent book called Regeneration, and he originally of Blessed Unrest, where he wrote about the emergence of social movements all across the world, and spoke of them as a kind of immunity system for the things that were going wrong. People were kind of engaging, and togetherness was kind of offering a way through. He said in his recent book, but he said, by the way, it's not your job to save the world. Yeah. I think that's really interesting, because actually it is our job to offer hope, to have a kind of gift which says, okay, we can create a language around these things, which is why I think this does relate to storytelling, but don't take on this whole burden. It's a step at a time. And if you can bring someone else on the journey, that's great. And if you can expand the numbers, it goes from individual to collective. So we have the hope emerges from that kind of space. But putting this great burden on ourselves is a kind of latter-day malaise almost. I think it is hard. I mean, I know these are really serious, and we need to talk about the bad stuff as well as the good. So we're not ignoring the bad stuff, but we have to find a kind of way through the forest, really.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's nicely put. And you kind of mentioned that kind of image before. And I thought it was very interesting that you talk in the book. I mean, the title, I'm calling it Sea Sagas. I keep calling it Sea Sagas because it's nicely produced, where the kind of Sea Sagas kind of sticks out. But it is Sea Sagas of the North. And then the subtitle, which again, you might want to just kind of talk us into, Travels and Tales at Warming Waters. Do you want to just explain that?
Yeah, well, I think that I wanted a hint of the climate crisis, and it is warming waters, and we know they are changing the nature of the ecosystems in these kind of northern seas and oceans. So that is happening. Things are moving as they are across the world into different ecosystems because of the warming that we're facing. So there is that, but also fishermen always spoke of being at a fishing ground, they would be at Iceland or at the north of Norway. And this is a kind of definition of place and identity, which I thought was really interesting. They weren't in the same way that when you talk of, in a similar way, when you talk about being on an island, around the coast of Essex, there are lots of islands, and you always talk about being on Mersey and on Canvey, and on Foulness, not in, but the places that are part of the main territory, we sort of talk about being in them, not on them. So being on is like being on a ship. You're on a ship, but you're not in a ship. You're never in a ship. You're on it. And so that those kind of subtleties of language seem to me to be saying something about kind of meaning and identity and kind of reasons for engagement with place, which then kind of offers the opportunity for doing something interesting about that. And so I think it does tie quite closely to stories. As you said, that sagas is in the title. There are kind of formal ways of thinking about the Icelandic sagas and the Scandinavian ones and the Norse and Anglo-Saxon Beowulf and so forth are framed in that kind of language. 150 sagas written or surviving from Iceland from the late 900s to the 1200s. An amazing kind of library of information and stories and engagements. So we have kind of lots of traditions of how to kind of tell about it, really. And I wanted to explore something different with it, for us now, and try to use some of those traditions in a particular way, which we'll come across when we come to the readings in a little bit. But it did strike me about the stories, and you know, sometimes kind of disparaged a little bit. You know, even the term might appear to some to be problematic, but of course they're central to all of our own lives. You know, if we say and we can't judge the audience because it's a webinar, we can't see everyone. But if we say, you know, a girl on a golden afternoon meets a rabbit and goes down a hole, we know precisely what the story is. It's kind of deep in our kind of culture. And the rabbit's not a rabbit, it's a hare. And the hare was always a trickster in folk stories in the UK. The great hare is a trickster in North America, in Japan, in West Africa, in South America. It's an animal that appears in stories all over the place. And so that's a recent one. But then you look at the story of another girl on a dark afternoon is walking through the forest. She has golden locks. She comes upon a swidden in the forest, and there's a charming cottage, and the door is open. So what do? Well, in the story, she goes in. You know, don't go in, really. She goes in. There's porridge on the table, 3 bowls. Don't eat the porridge. She eats the porridge. Don't fall asleep in one of the beds. She falls asleep, and then bears come in. Okay, so we know that kind of story, but there haven't been bears in Britain since 450 AD. You know, that was about the last time they were wild. I mean, they were captured ones that were performing and so forth. But we're quite happy to accept a sort of, here's a story that has kind of right and wrong, that has a moral content, which all traditional oral stories always have a moral content in them. And it dates back to the time, you know, 1500 years ago, when we would have said, we wouldn't have blinked about the idea of having bears in the wild. And yet we take that with a story now quite happily. So I think there's an interesting construction of the components and the actors within stories, and then, you know, what they also mean in terms of the journey. So Joseph Campbell, the hero with 1,000 faces, 1949, the very famous kind of construction of the heroic journey and everything that goes with that, the stepping across the threshold, you know, being led into the kind of special world, finding the elixir of life, coming back again, all that kind of stuff. And that frames an awful lot of the way that we see the world. And Campbell says, when you, I know I'm reusing the same metaphor, but Campbell says, when you enter the forest at its darkest point, at your darkest hour, there is no path. The idea is to make your own way. So that's the starting point. But of course, we don't make our own way. We need help with that. And that's often where the tricksters appear in the stories, as they trick us into doing things differently. But then we need the support of others to help through the difficult journey, which is the story of every human life. It's a journey. It's you know, the ontology of the journey is you know, big kind of thresholds that you cross from little school to big school, from big school to university, to getting your first big job, to being married, or somebody dying, or having to go somewhere new. These are all kind of threshold challenges that we face. And to finish this point, I would say that's precisely where we find ourselves with these big crises. We know about them, we know what they are, they're super worrying. So how do we actually engage with them in a way that makes us feel as though our agency is respected and has up by ourselves and has opportunity to change the world, and others, we can bring others along with ourselves. And so Sea Sagas of the North has lots of these components of journeys, engagement, support, togetherness, rescuing the very fishers whom, you know, a little while ago, they were coming to Iceland to capture your fish. And then the people on the shore never hesitate when they go to rescue people. And understanding that kind of psychology, I think, helps us get out of some of these big problems.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, you talk about these, you know, these Icelandic sea sagas, incredible kind of artifacts, really, of storytelling from, as you say, sort of 9th century or whatever. But one of the stories that you tell in the book is a story of kind of climate change related, certainly, and of the drowning of East Anglia and the drowning of what we now call Doggerland after the Professor Bryony Coles' use of the term back in 87 or whatever, or, you know, somewhere around then.
A bit later, 98 actually. Yep.
Was it? Yeah.
Yeah.
But Do you want to tell us a little bit about Doggerland? Because I think that was, again, I was pleased to see you kind of referencing this in a book of Sea Sagas, because this is going like way back into prehistory. And I think we can learn a lot from thinking about how people kind of dealt with, reacted to this kind of situation and circumstance, if you like.
Absolutely, yes, and perhaps I'll then do the short reading as well.
Yeah, that would be great, Jules. Thank you.
Yeah, so I wrote the saga called Drowning of Doggerland and put it at the end of the book, not at the beginning, not in kind of historical order, in a sense, because I wanted that to be saying to us, you know what, 8,000 years or so ago, the climate changed and went from cold to warm. And that warming, hence the warming waters, warm water takes up more space, so it goes upwards, and therefore it floods lands. And we now know that the area called the North Sea was entirely dry. And it's only recently that we kind of didn't know that. People had, fishermen had dredged it up, very often remains from the floor of the North Sea, but everyone's kind of common view was that they must have been washed in by currents rather than being of that particular place. And archaeologists like Brian Eccles and others have kind of have made us realize that actually the North Sea was dry across to what is now the continent and north to the Shetland. So the Shetland Isles were the hills, the Zetland Hills at the top of Doggerland. So Doggerland was a big plain, a steppe, with big herds of animals, aurochs and mammoths and rhinoceroses and antelope and hunter-gatherer tribes moving around with them, as they do in Central Asia, for example, or as they did in the prairies of North America. And it's the kind of knowledge of how people today live in those circumstances that I brought to the tale of the Drowning of Doggerland. It is because it has this kind of very recent understanding that this land that once was dry was flooded. And the story is that the people who leave the land and they come towards the shore, and the question is, what happens? What happens when they come to the people who are on the cliffs? And we can imagine those cliffs as being in kind of Essex or Suffolk or Norfolk or on the Hull, Humberside shore or something like that. They're the very cliffs where these people are coming to.
Mm-hmm.
Shall I go with the read?
Yeah, are you happy to read for us? That'd be really nice.
Yeah,
Take a little pause. Everyone can have a little pause, and we'll just listen to you do.
Yeah, it's not the whole of it. It's an excerpt. So it's at the beginning, a couple of verses, a verse from the middle, a couple of verses from the middle, and then one from the end. And I would just say this: when the sea was rising, no one knew when it would stop or where it would stop. Yeah. We today can predict, because of scientific data and modeling and forward projections, we can say, well, you know, this kind of temperature is going to mean the sea will come up by this much, and we know what's going to happen. But at the time, as the sea came up, nobody knew. And it is worth saying that the oldest surviving written story is Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh is the story of the flood. The flood comes and washes away all the problems of the cities, and these kind of flood stories are deep in our history. It's speculation, but it would be interesting to think that actually Gilgamesh comes along not long after the flooding of Doggerland. It's entirely possible that the writer of Gilgamesh had direct experience or direct kind of oral tradition that came from actual flooding events of this sort. Let me go with this. So what I generally say to people is kind of settle down. You know, we're sitting around the hearth, we're telling a story now, the fire's burning, the children are in the shadows messing around, and here's a little story called The Drowning of Doggerland. It is said the sky people once were numerous, but they had drowned and every dark hide of land and fire pit, each vale and fell had been seized by the rising flood. The swell of sea had beaten down defence, so they launched their boats, lashed and loaded auroch skin, and flexed the oars. Among the firs and flutes were sobbing infants, fastened tight to strakes of birch. At last ahead appeared a strip of land. They saw a hall upon the cliff. It seemed no spell they cast, no cry to gods by these blue-eyed people who could beat the wind and slip with bow inside the range of creatures on the hunt. It seemed they could not counter how a poison had been cast that sunk their world, their land that fell before the ceaseless tide, as does the oak before the axe. The brine now bore them on, toward a beach where figures stood in shadows under sighing pines. The squadron now drew near. The forest people watched this ragged fleet approach. They drew ash bows, for this had been a year of shore attacks and sorrow, so took the strain. Herne, the king, called to arms, away the anchors, sail round the flanks. Yet Queen Ursa was renowned, her long sight best in tribe, and she now observed, there are babies in those boats. I see no shields arrayed. We should pause and help these people come ashore. After countless battles, Herne, the fabled hunter, now could see these folk were people fleeing demons, and to the elite platoon he ordered, stow your bows and lance, but be on guard. Send reserves to ride and help. A tall woman stepped ashore from the leading vessel. Others staggered at the land. Hands pulled the boats through breakers. An infant fell, and Ursa shouted to the rescue party, watch those children. One was face down in the wash. The boat people scattered over sand and dunes, gazed up at mottled sky, muttered thanks to gods of solid land, and drank from skins of water that the forest people proffered, who now could see this was the hour for a rescue, not an echo of the days when flames were lit on seaward ridge and summit to wreck on rocks such passing ships, nor would they need to darken skies, firing arrows at marauders. Sit with us, hailed the Green King of wooden Swidden from his splendorous hall. Here is roasted meat and honey. Our trees are dense with fruit. Here is draught for all to drink. And the dark-skinned woman, her one eye crimped, stood tall before her people, bowed to king and queen, thanked them for their kindness, said quietly, we have come far. Our homes have drowned. And the king motioned, lay your goods on polished floor. You are safe to rest with us. The king paused by his sergeant. Send a party to the pines and dig the pits for those bodies lying on the shore. And said to leader, her name was Sky Rider of the Shore. Our people live in marveled woods. We will tell how our children run with deer and elk, how this to us is paradise. And Ursa smiled. When you've fully rested, you must voice the story of your people and this soak. But first we all will walk and give our prayers together for those babies laid in tiny graves. So the story goes on, and Sky Rider, the leader of the tribe that's come to the shore, tells her story. It's a story within a story. So her tale commences. And there's a psychological moment, I imagined, happened as they retreated to what was called Dogger Isle, as Dogger Land as a whole was surrounded by water. Gulls seethed about the shore. Sooty petrel plunged. Cold cried the cormorant. I knew it was another sign. We could not tame this tempest. All our shamans tried. Had we eaten fish forbidden? Had a snake whispered in the grass? No one could recall. It seemed we had been fastened inside a frightful spell, and one sharp dawn came a shocking sight. The sun star rose from water, later slipped into the western waves. Well, silence followed stories. Skye's tale was near complete. Gripped by the spell of words, the forest people then applauded, tapping hilts of knife on hollow blocks of wood. She had filled their sinews with every kind of sorrow. So the people on the cliff top passed from hand to hand more horns of mead, and turned the spits of meat that soon would fully roast, and reclined in humming meadow, building back the tales about the flooded people of the plain. Well, Hearn declared his plan. We will take you to the land of chalk and cloud, to meadows blooming to the horizon. The time for grief is gone. You can mark each place, mend the moon, and heal the land. And perhaps one day they would sleep without a troubling dream, for that sea did stop, even as it had been deaf to cries. Can you imagine? Herring now have followed, and they will swim far across that novel northern sea. And that's the end of The Drowning of Doggerland.
Thanks, Jules. That's very powerful. It's a kind of incident in prehistory that I find absolutely fascinating. And as you say, it's only really relatively recently that the kind of scientists have started to kind of recognize, and the archaeologists are doing their work, etc. And this it's a kind of gradual process of Doggerland being erased, if you like. But also within that is this story of, which you kind of hint at, I think, a little bit in your saga, is this incident known as the Storegga incident in prehistory, sort of about 8,000 years ago, where this massive section of Norway just kind of falls off. And that causes a huge tsunami to just come down what we now call the North Sea. And again, that kind of huge, like incredible kind of cataclysmic incident, as you're kind of going to, it's going to be remembered in story, for, well, until now, isn't it?
Exactly.
And this is fascinating.
There is a kind of giving voice to this. I mean, this is a kind of, an act of the imagination. But we are trying to kind of give voice to, I think, to what happens in the process of kind of change. In this case, we framed us at the beginning of climate, ecological, social inequality crises, and how do we get out of it? And we really hope that we'll meet people with kindness. They will kind of welcome us and say, actually, this is the way that kind of human cultures have always survived, by focusing on togetherness through kind of collective action. Humans would have never come this far if we had been entirely selfish. Of course, people have individual interests at heart, but they mediate that with the nature and society and culture around them. So I'm trying to kind of use those sorts of ideas in a reflection of the kinds of things that have happened around North Sea and the North Atlantic. Yeah, that's great. And of course, again, one of the kind of current movements, thankfully, is the more kind of widespread recognition of indigenous knowledge, indigenous cultural truths, and the way that they can kind of help us to relate to the natural world, to live with the natural world. We are always a part of the natural world, as we know. But I think I mean, you've written about this for many years, and I've often appreciated your kind of take on these things. But it's lovely to see some of these ideas kind of getting more into the mainstream, if you like, being recognised more kind of globally as these kind of human truths about ways in which we can exist on this earth. Exactly. And well, a shout out at this moment then for the MA that you run. I mean, there's the Wild Writing MA at Essex that we run from the institution, that is very successful and is producing each year cohorts of fine writers and people with new kind of angles and takes upon the way the world works. And I think that is enriching. I mean, I think it kind of it gives us this kind of sense that that this is a job that will never be done. I mean, there's so much that we can investigate, to look at in contemporary times, but also looking backwards, and that gives us that creativity, I think, gives us kind of space and hope. I'm very interested in how we approach kind of silence as well. The tales are written with in the kind of a Anglo-Saxon or Norse format of a caesura, a gap in the middle of each line with a kind of balanced number of syllables on each side, and alliteration, as you will have heard in the talk there. But I'm interested in how we allow little bits of silence to kind of come into into the stories and the things that we're talking about. There's a Tuscan proverb that goes, "A tale is not beautiful if nothing is added to it." So I think that there's something about stories that, if they're good, and if they are good enough, as it were, and the audience is able to engage with them, hear them, they settle into us a little bit, then we bring creativity to that ourselves, a form of imagination as well. We're not illustrating, we're just using words. I mean, they're just scratches on a piece of paper, or on a computer screen at the moment. They're bits of black and white stuff, and then we convert them in this kind of extraordinary way into a narrative arc that has understanding for us. So I think that it's the words and it's the bits of silence, and it's in those spaces that we're able to kind of bring something to each of the tales, and to encourage many indeed to kind of try their hand, but also to tell others about what this all means. I mean, there's that lovely poem that I love to quote at the end of, quite often at the end of talks, from Mary Oliver, the instructions for living a life, where she says, "Pay attention, be astonished, tell about it." So for me, I mean, she's brilliant. Absolutely. She died 3 years ago, didn't she? She's absolutely brilliant. I mean, to kind of boil down it all to that: pay attention to the world, the natural world, the social world, the cultural world around us. Be astonished by it. Just kind of go, wow, crikey, isn't it? What about that? But then tell others about it as well. And that telling, of course, means stories. And it also means collective action, I think, from the back of that. Could I say something about hope as well? Because in this, I think there is something interesting about what people have been saying about hope. Rebecca Solnit, wonderful writer, written about walking, written about nature, written about kind of social engagement, about kind of collective action, wrote a fantastic book a few years ago called Hope in the Dark. And she said that hope doesn't come from the limelight. The limelight shines on the powerful because they're in the limelight. Hope comes from the darkness, the shadows around the outside of the limelight, from the smaller people, the dispossessed, those who don't have a voice, those who are gaslighted in kind of modern parlance. And so actually what you need hope to do is to go from the individual to the collective. That's the way that you get the change, and you have to kind of search in those kind of places for the opportunities to see the world differently and to do things differently. Martin Luther King said, we must accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope. I think that's kind of quite interesting. We're not saying, I don't think any of us are saying this is simple, or that the world can be reduced to a kind of Pollyanna-ish simplicity. It's just going to be all fine if we say it's fine. It's not. But however, we've still got to feel as though there's kind of agency in that space to work our way through it. And some of that hope comes from language and stories, and some of it comes from what people are doing, that we can use as it were, kind of evidence of hope. You can point towards places and say, well, what about that lot over there? One example from the book, the kinds of things that are happening in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. Since 2003, the Land Reform Act, and now the 2015 Further Community Assets Act allows people to purchase community assets. And 27 islands and estates have been converted to community ownership over that time. A total of 400 assets across Scotland. I mean, it's a fantastic story, actually. I mean, you could say if only that were to be happening more widely. I think I would say that, actually.
Yes,
and those islands and estates, Isle of Egg, Gia, Ascent, Knoydart, Harris, Lewis, other places, are now in individual ownership. Individual local people as kind of collectives. So they've gone away from the distant lairds and landlords. And now you find islands that have converted to, as it were, clean energy, renewable energy, focusing on locally grown food, developing new businesses, investing in affordable housing. Visitor numbers are increasing. They're setting out walking trails, heritage renewal, rebuilding schools. People are moving back in again. I mean, there's a long list of things where you go, wow, that's interesting. These are on the periphery, and they're beautiful places, and actually people want to live there. And if you take somewhere like the Isle of Egg or Gia, which are 100% renewable, are they affected by the current energy crisis? No, because they're all renewable already. So the kind of the changes in the gas prices and the geopolitical ructions going with that are not affecting that. So that's a small example. If I were to give you one other specific example related to that, I would say what links. These are two of the locations in this book. What links Iceland, Norway, Costa Rica, Paraguay, and Albania? So one would say, well, they're all kind of small places. Yes. The answer. The clue was in the previous bit. They're all 100% renewable in terms of their energy for conversion into electricity. So none of those have been touched by the current crisis. I see your cat is coming to play as well. That's lovely.
She likes to keep apart.
People like cats, so
yeah, that's fine.
So those 5 countries are providing, as it were, evidence of hope. So within this kind of North Sea, North Atlantic milieu, there are countries and places doing things very differently that speak to those original crises, and they are to do with local engagement, collective action, people working together, people inventing a new way of living. And I think that's interesting. I think that creates a real super interesting territory for us all to engage with, think about, and to encourage.
Yeah, very much. Nicely put, Jules. Sorry, I'm going to give a little shout out to everybody. If you do want to put a question in the chat, please do. I can't see any yet, but maybe it's me. I probably need my glasses on or something, but please do if you've got a burning question, kind of thing. But it's very interesting, Jules, that you say about that notion of, this kind of movement that is taking place along, a number of islands within our archipelago, for example, and the comparison of what's happening with land reform and the relationship of people who live there, if you like, to their landscapes, to their natural worlds. And unfortunately in England, that it is so much more difficult to do because we have such a complex issue of land ownership, if you like. And I mean, there's some really good organizations. If I can just big up an organization that I've been working with recently called Wildcard, who are just gently trying to push the Crown Estates, the Church Commissioners, and Oxbridge to start to rewild some of their land as a kind of push, because in England, these large organizations are hugely powerful, and what they do can really affect how the movement rolls. So it's very interesting, as you say, seeing some of these extremely valuable tales of kind of sea folk, if you like, up in largely in Scotland, as you say, but kind of on a wider scale, who are very much working together as communities and dealing to a certain extent on their local scale with some of the climate issues that they're having to deal with. Exactly.
Here's another example and I was up here in August this summer. Northern Iceland, there's a small ex-fishing town called Húsavík, and just like a mini old fishing communities that we can imagine in the UK, after the fishing collapse, after the bringing in of quotas, which are captured by the big operators and the smaller excluded. This was kind of common across all places, didn't just happen here. The local communities lost their opportunity to be able to fish, and Husavik, a town of, I say town, but you might call it a village, 2,000 people, had no kind of sense of what they could do. And somebody clever says, we should try to convert what we do in our ships to whale watching. And Husavik turns from being a capture-based community to becoming one that's tourism-based. And at the beginning, none of the fishermen think this is possible. They all say, really? People are going to pay to come and look at whales, and you're not even going to see all of them, just going to see a bit of a flipper or a tail. And now these are kind of pre-pandemic data, but actually the numbers are going up again now as people go back. 100,000 visitors a year come to Husavik to see the whales. There's whale watching in almost every community around the north of Iceland. The local harbour quarter is regenerated. There are cafes, restaurants, there's a new museum, there are new hotels, there are jobs in this tiny little place that have come back on rewilding. This kind of idea of saying, all right, if we look after these things in some sort of way, and when it comes to whales, it means not killing them, just letting them kind of get on with stuff. You don't have to do any other intervention. You haven't got to kind of do anything direct. You just got to let them live.
Yeah.
And bingo. And you know what? There's another little bit of the story, which is that we realize that whales are keystone species, and the presence of whales results in large amounts of carbon sequestration because they move nutrients around in the water column. They excrete the nutrients, and they produce more productivity in the water, which takes up carbon and locks it up. And there's a kind of calculations have been done to say we're about 1.5 million whales worldwide at the moment. It used to be 5 pre-whaling, industrial whaling. If we could get to 5, they would actually result in the capture of 2 gigatons, 2 billion tons of carbon. And we need to go from 53 to 10 to save the world, if we can put it that way. The emissions at 53, if we got to 10, as the UN Secretary General has been saying just a few minutes ago, we've got to cut emissions and suck up carbon at the same time as much as we can. Just whales alone could do 2 gigatons, and that's amazing. So if we find ways to let the planet do its bit through rewilding, regeneration, renewal, through kind of cultural acceptability of these things, and help people create jobs and ways of living at the same time, we're actually onto something really interesting. So
I found that fascinating in the book when you started to talk about this way in which whales, which are central to a lot of these sea sagas, can also be helping us with our
they suddenly change from being something that people captured, and the controversy that goes with that. I mean, it makes me feel uncomfortable thinking about that and arguing for some communities still arguing for that as being a central part of their culture. I get why that's important, but it still leaves me feeling uncomfortable. So in a sense, I'd rather we talked out the other side of things, but real interesting opportunities there.
Sorry, I must just add in that someone's very kindly said a question in that there's a problem with the chat, that they can't put anything in the chat. So if you can't, we'll have a look at that. If you can't, put something in the question and answer, what's down as Q&A on your little seam there, so which should be fine, because I've just been able to see anonymous person who kindly said that the chat function seems to be disabled, but I'm sure we'll try and have a look at that anyway.
Right, Esther, if you could have a go at that, seeing if something is switched. I wondered why some questions weren't coming through, so that would explain why. So we're getting something
Yes, indeed.
in question. So Sarah said mine too. So stick your things in the Q&A, because something seems to be coming through there rather than using the chat. So apologies, folks. But perhaps Esther can have a look in the background.
Yeah, well, but do stick your questions in there, and we'll go to there. Yeah, the Wales thing is absolutely fascinating, isn't it? And as you say, that there is this kind of slight conundrum, if you like. You go to a lot of these sort of seafaring spaces of the archipelago, etc., and you meet people. Like I remember going up to the Outer Hebrides not that long ago, and having an amazing chat with someone who'd been in the whaling industry as a young man, and he said how exciting it was, how thrilling it was to be, showed me photos of standing within a whale, etc. But he also recognized that was not something that ultimately, as a kind of human industry, had done any good. So I think, again, it's that notion of hope, isn't it? And the intelligence of these communities to recognize that is a past that can't continue. Though it's interesting, you do also in the book kind of, I think, is it called the grind? These kind of events where communities will kind of massacre a whole load of whales within, and that still takes place, doesn't it?
That's in the Faroes. Yes, that still takes place, and it's fiercely protected. And there are activists come in to try to prevent people from doing that, and it's a space of conflict and difficulty, and it's very tricky. It's really, really difficult because it's a traditional practice. It's a way of getting protein on pretty kind of barren places. Is to use the sea in that way. So Esther has just said that chat should work, and I'm seeing something come through, and there is a question from Robert Golden as well, which I can address in a moment if we kind of want to move on. Yeah, I think we're left with just difficulties, and I think that's sort of fine. I know we like to resolve things into, yes, that's kind of on the side of the angels, and that's not. But actually the world is super complex, and it does change over time. People's views do change, and engagement is usually the best way of doing that. And the center part of that, of course, is always about how we tell stories to each other and make sense of things.
Yeah, sure. Look, maybe we should...
that's great. They are coming through now.
I'll go to some of the Q&A, because obviously we've been, we're conscious of... I'd like to try and get a second reading in.
I'm ready for a second reading. Absolutely. Yeah.
But maybe we should. I mean, it does fit that perhaps. I mean, there's a question here. I mean, Robert's question was is a kind of wider question about the roots of the language style you use in this book. I don't know if you want to talk about that
absolutely, yes,
a little bit. You've sort of mentioned aspects of the language. I think that's a really interesting part to pick up on.
Yeah, I think that the roots of the language style do come from the kind of the Anglo-Saxon and the Norse, which were very similar languages. I mean, they didn't diverge for a long time, but it is a style that is available in the poems like the Seafarer, like the Dream of the Rood, like Beowulf, that were, or the Battle of Malden, for example, which was written in as it was then Anglo-Saxon, and some had then been translated in that way. So the alliterative nature was part of the style. Some of them are just amazingly complex. The what people developed as ways of doing these, too much for me to kind of think about actually how they did this. Very often in an oral, completely oral sense. There were skalds, poets who went from place to place. There were skalds who were hired by kings and courts. Many of them were Icelandic, who traveled around the region, and they were hired to come and tell good stuff about the king, so they had to kind of stand up, and later on it was jesters who did that sort of thing, but that was a medieval thing. This is pre-medieval. And so they told the stories of how kind of grand and wonderful the king and queen were, because they were paying the money. But their inventions were oral, and they are fantastic capability that people had at the time. So that's where this comes from, and I've used that as the way into trying to create something that probably that does work on the page. You can read it, but I think I always say to people, for when it comes to the saga bits, and just to remake this point, there are parts of the book that are prose chapters, and then interspersed there are these sagas as well, the alliterative sagas, and I think you almost have to read them as if you're speaking them out loud, and I think the kind of speaking out loud does work kind of quite well.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean that's what they're made for, aren't they?
Yeah,
Made. I mean, slightly related question, but probably a good time for you to look at it is Martin's question about how did Britain forget its Viking northern heritage, including caring for common resources, and what from Sea Saga stories can shift us beyond the current extreme individualism and ecocidal. Oh, I've just lost that. Ecocidal something.
So it's just dropped out of my page as well.
It's just gone. It's
yeah,
just gone.
it was there.
Ecocidal something.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think it was about individualism and going back to the kind of collective.
Yeah, that's right.
So
that heritage from, as I said, from Viking and kind of northern kind of.
Yeah, I think it's kind of, it is. I mean, it's obviously this is a big kind of question about history. It's about learning and forgetting. And kind of coming together and breaking apart that period from when the Norse first arrive in Lindisfarne is in 792. So Anglo-Saxon culture has been in what is now the UK for a couple of hundred years, or slightly more than that, getting on for 300 years. Norse arrive in 792, and the Norse and the Danes are kind of jointly called Vikings, and then they come and settle, and then you're talking about from 800 to the mid 1000s of close interaction. And I suppose we in the Victorian era in particular, I think, is when the popularization of the Vikings as terrors and horrors was sort of became part of our kind of cultural understanding, which most people take to be, they were raiders and people were raiding and doing that kind of stuff, but they weren't kind of quite as they have been painted. That melding of the Anglo-Saxon and the Norse cultures into one kind of culture, when Canute is the king in the 1000s from 1017 to 1035, he unites Denmark and Britain under one kind of kingdom. It was the same kind of kingdom, and people didn't see a difference at that stage. But then the big item then becomes William the Conqueror and the French side of things, which William the Conqueror, going back 4 generations, was Viking. I mean, Normandy is the land of the Northmen, the Northman land. So Normandy was precisely Viking as well. They become French and they come over. So I think we just forget these things. And that's kind of what happens with big changes like this. So I think we're in the business of trying to remember stuff.
Very nice. Jules, maybe we could work towards your second reading.
Shall we do the second?
People do appreciate. Thomas Dobbs, don't worry, I haven't forgotten your question. It's a brute of a question, but we will come back to it. But yeah, Jules, if you are happy to, we've still got time for more questions. So please, if you have other questions, audience, do add them in. Q&A. I think
that's a good question. That's from Tom Dobbs from South Dakota. That's a good question from South Dakota, Tom. Lovely. And Robert's brought in, and Robert Golden said, I do read them slowly, whispering to myself. That's really nice, actually. I like that. That's super. Tom, we'll come back to your big one there in just a moment. We thought that we would do an excerpt from the tale called Barge Requiem. And this is set at the end of the 1940s on the east side of Britain. So we're talking about the east coast of Suffolk and Essex and Kent. And it's the end of the days of sail. So we're just after the end of the Second World War. And the barges that carried all the goods up and down the North Sea. The North Sea was the motorway of the land, even till then. And there would be 1,000 barges on the London River, as it was then called, and still sailing people still call the Thames the London River. They never call it the Thames. It's the Thames estuary and the London River. And so things were being moved by sail, which is a sort of slightly interesting kind of observation now when we're trying to move towards more renewable ways of moving things around. However, this is a culture that's about to die. So Barge Requiem is the end of the tale, and I'll start with the opening 3 verses and then go to the end of the tale. In the middle, the bit I'm missing is when the bargeman travels with his daughter, takes his daughter as the skipper on the ship, and they travel up to move things around and get caught in a big storm. But you can read that bit separately if you wish. But I wanted to set the scene for the kind of end of a culture, because we were talking about this intersection between ecological and climate change and social and cultural change, and how the things are kind of tied together. So shall we try that?
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, folks, so here's this is the second reading. It's called Barge Requiem. Beneath the summer sky, the last coasting bargemen felt forced to shiver, for they could see that dark advanced. It seemed the days of sail would shortly cease. An abandoned barge in creek, another bracing seawall hole, a skeleton of timber ribs swamped by banks of lavender. In time, each corpse would rot, and by the salty tide, each skipper and his mate would then be stranded on the beach. Oh, how they wished they still could race the sea roads. Standing tall at transom's stern, a wind-burnt captain would cradle smouldering pipe, look to moonway under stars, 70 years on wood, a ceaseless search for wind. What quiet men were these, the crew of sighing barge, often deep in peace, 20 leagues from buoy light beaming. By help of wind and spritsail rig, they hauled 200 tons of coal, a load of wheat or block cement, linseed sacks or sugar. Many a working day, they could be wet to waist in sea. Captain Jack began as barge boy, lived his life below the sail. Schooled by tidal river, sensing every weather sign, he had a rolling pace on land, the long eyes of a waterman. His final ship was the Cambria, built at shipyard on the marsh. Drawing single salty fathom, it had 5,000 red square feet of sail. By mizzen main and topsail, shroud and topping lift, by flying jib and job, blocks run up the ropes, you could never beat a bargeman in a tideway. The story then goes on of them travelling to Poole and to Snape Maltings, and up to Hull and Keadby and back again south. So they're now coming back after a big storm, caught up in the storm. They're now heading back to the London River. So this is towards the end of the tale. It was filthy black and bleak, the dark London River. None of the beauty of the open water. There were curlew called on flats, oil pooled on water. There was smoke and smog above, and chaos at the docks, the hubbub hard to bear. Rattling donkey engines, lighter men unloading coal, they fled the river clutches. And there, at the estuary mouth, was moored the Will Everard, rival barge to the Cambria, whispered Jack. Put on hatches, we might just race her. At the quiet of morning tide, Jack took the wheel and crept away, but the Will was going too, and now it started. Low sun twinkled on the sea. They tacked together. One seized the wind, the other spoiled. From above, the circling gulls saw the barges charge at one another, each skipper still as rock, playing bluff and double. Neither gave a quarter. glaring straight ahead, taking in the wind, every wrinkle on the water. The will bore away, pouring under lee by inches. The battle raged, tack for tack. Neither gained advantage, until a shout of glory from the bow. Bill was jumping up and down and waving arms. She's aground. She's on the Shoebury. She's up afield, stuck on bloody Essex. What a taste of pleasure. What a racing win. This story that could grow with telling in the ports along the coast. They cruised up the Colne, defeated by the noise of shipyards in the marsh, and beyond the facing villages, children skipped along the seawall. So Thora waved and shouted back. The harvest now was in. So a mill at Kent was cooking straw to mash, for the country had no wood for paper. The final journey of this barge was to carry 50 tons of straw. At the port, the three lay back, lazed beneath the cloudless sky, as men from fields and farm worked their stacking hooks. They quietly sailed that night, left a parting line of phosphorescence, and moored on sandbank, listening to the roar of wind in trees ashore, stepping down to solid land. It was their final view of stars from out at sea. At dawn, they now could hear larks singing from the coast, and viewed on eastern skyline the copper flood of light. It was their closing requiem. So Thora steered from sea to creek. Jack and Bill were at the stern, staring at the passing water. That's Barge Requiem.
Thank you very much, Jules. That's really nice.
Lovely.
Thank you. Yeah, it's powerful, powerful. You can go to Malden, I guess. Is Malden the best place to go and see?
Yes. I mean, Malden has barge trips you can take, but also from Ipswich docks that will take down the Orwell to the big open area where the Stour and the Orwell and behind Harwich and Felixstowe. Those are lovely trips. But also you can do the same on the Blackwater from Malden. So super. So those are both the Cambria. Cambria is still around. You can still see it. So in some ways there is a kind of little echo of the whale story here, is that the barges as carriers of goods, cement and wheat and linseed and coal, that disappears, but now we have barges as kind of tourist opportunities, as a way of seeing the world from under sail, and that's a wonderful thing. It has kind of echoes of the whale story. Actually, it's interesting.
Sure. No, it's fascinating, isn't it? Okay, let's I'm slightly conscious of the time. People, we said we'd finish about 1:45, but I just wanted to mention Elizabeth's comment about I read the saga sections out loud, walking around the house. The embodiments seem to lend them lyricism and energy.
That's nice.
That's a lovely endorsement.
That's lovely. Thank you, Liz. That's great, actually.
And we should go back to Thomas Dobbs' question, which I'll try to read out, and perhaps you could just give it a minute or so of answer. It's now apparent the world will not come to grips with global warming in time to prevent massive sea rise, which means the flood of many doglands. With the rise of far-right anti-immigration governments, what can be done to encourage the kind of welcoming you depicted in the saga?
That's great. That's great. Tom was a visitor to the University of Essex back in 2001 or 2, something like that. Cool. Tom, you'd have to remind me. It was so he was here for a year. Well, that is such an important question. We still have a window, actually, and this is not inevitable. The worst of the worst. We do need. So this is just a kind of statement of that first bit. We're in the decade that matters. We've got to reduce emissions by 50% this decade, another 50% by the next decade, and another 50% by 2050. So from 100 to 50, 50 to 25, 25 to 12.5%. And that would do it. that is all it takes, he said. So if we were to leave every bit of fossil fuel in the ground, we would be fine. We would kind of get there. But of course, we've spent 200 years tying our economy to fossil fuel, so it's super difficult to unlock from that. So it does look really difficult. But we're in the decade that matters. We have still got opportunity and agency, and it still can be done. I think the second part of the question with the rise of anti-immigration, we get that, we hear that here. We have, I don't want to point towards a particular view, we have politicians celebrating the fact that they would like to see people flown to a country in Africa because that is seen as a sort of progressive outcome. It simply isn't. I mean, this is just crackers. Humans have never done that. Our kind of way of interacting and living together and engaging has been who we are and what we are. So I think the only answer to that is to keep, obviously there's kind of activism, there's legal action, there's a whole range of institutional approaches to that, but I think there is also storytelling. We have to keep saying this is important to us. The world is the same, humans are the same the world over. We start in the same place with, as they would say in Japan, with an empty mind when we are born, and our culture and ecology and our language determines how we would then develop. And I think we just simply have to keep on pushing that and keep on making the point that progressive, good ways of seeing the world are to encourage that kind of interaction. I know it looks really difficult at times, but we have to believe it will work. I mean, there are countries that are taking this kind of view that, and again, there are stories in the tale that I tell about Denmark and the rescue of the 8,000 Danish Jews from Gilleleje in northern Denmark, in a flotilla of small boats that go one night in October and take people safely across to Sweden in a similar kind of foundation myth as the Dunkirk small boats are to Britain. You know, the rescue of the army by people, you know, almost rowing across to the other side. Well, actually, that's kind of what happened with the Oresund and the Kattegat, is that people took, fishermen and boat owners took Danish Jews across to Sweden, came back, did it many times under the kind of glare. So we're good at this. Yeah, we're good at this, but it just does look, I know, really difficult. And I know that Tom is talking from the more polarized context of the United States at the moment, and it does look at times really, really difficult. But I think we just have to keep saying there is hope,
sure,
even though that's difficult.
Yeah, that's really nice. I mean, I think that's kind of where we started this to a certain extent, that notion of hope that you linked with storytelling and the interconnectedness, that kind of web of life. It's possibly a good place for us to kind of pause.
Yeah, it is.
Let's just, I'm conscious. Yeah, that's nice. Sarah saying how the grey whales are recovering their numbers in Baja California.
Let me give you a quote from a crofter from those Highlands and Islands. So it's a crofter from Harris, one of the kind of larger islands. And he said, you belong to the land, not the land belongs to us. So he kind of said, this is what this means, this thing that we now have technical ownership of what was an estate owned by a distant landlord, and we can do all of these things. He said, the nature doesn't belong to us, we belong to it. And I thought that was a really interesting thing about kind of belonging, identity, wisdom of thinking about the way the world works and how we can intervene to do something about it. And I think that's at the core of almost all the stories in the book. They are about kind of agency, and they are about bad stuff. People get wrecked. They say that the cemeteries of fishing villages fill up more slowly than those inland, because many of the adults are drowned at sea.
Yeah.
So they're not there. And what they used to do in Grimsby, I don't know, it's just where the story kind of emerges from, but I think happened in other places. People used to fill the coffins with stones to give them heft, because there were no bodies in them when they had funerals, because the sailors were at sea. So this is, you know, the context is of a difficult, dangerous life, which really needed the kind of kindness that we're talking about to give people hope and a sense of worth amongst the difficulty. And I suppose that is kind of part of the answer to Tom as well, I think, perhaps.
Sure, yeah. Absolutely. I was thinking that but Robert's kind of come in with something. We do not own the land, we maintain it for our children, and this that it's a very themes around that. Thank you, Robert, for putting that across. But themes around that I think are global. If you go to indigenous cultures, it reminded me of a very similar proverb from the Aboriginal people of Australia, where you have this same idea about notions of ownership and how the land owns us. Kind of thing.
Yes, exactly. Lovely. Very good.
Yeah, look, we should pause. Ladies and gentlemen, people of the Zoom, go buy it. Go tell your children, your friends, your neighbours. And thank you so much for coming along tonight.
And a shout out for your book, which was featured at the beginning, the Oak Papers.
Very kind.
Shout out for you, the interconnectedness of the world, and just one small part of that, the amazing stories of how trees are not individuals, they're connected up to others. The mother tree, the story that Susan Simard wrote about, her book, and old ancient trees being connected up to 250 plus other trees underground through fungal pathways. They're not individuals, they're communities. And that's actually, I think that's what we've been talking about today.
It's so true, isn't it? Yeah, it's so true. Brings us back too. But Jules, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts and your knowledge. And as I say, gathering these Sea Sagas of the North, I found it absolutely fascinating, as clearly as others already have evidenced by our Q&A stroke chat. So thanks everybody. I know this is being recorded, so it will be available for you to sit down and watch again sometime, or tell your friends and neighbors, etc., to go and watch and listen to Jules talking about the Sea Sagas. So thank you very much. Enjoy your evening, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you very much, everybody. It's been a real pleasure. I'm sorry we can't actually see you all, but this is the easiest way with the webinars to do these things. But we've got the questions and answers and the chat working in the end, so that was marvelous. Thanks for coming on. That's lovely. Thank you, James. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
We'll sign off now.